By 1936, the American motorcycle industry was fighting for its very life in the suffocating grip of the Great Depression. Harley-Davidson had watched their annual production numbers completely collapse from over 21,000 units in the late 1920s to a terrifyingly low 3,000 machines just a few years later. The vast factory floors in Milwaukee were eerily quiet, and the corporate ledgers were bleeding red ink with no clear end to the economic misery in sight. The company was surviving almost solely on municipal police department contracts, commercial delivery tricycle sales, and an intensely loyal but financially destitute core rider base. Their primary domestic competitor, the Indian Motorcycle Company, was aggressively pushing forward with heavily stylized and highly refined flathead designs like the Indian Chief 74. To combat this looming threat, Harley-Davidson engineers knew they could no longer rely exclusively on their traditional side-valve flathead engines. The flathead design was undeniably reliable and simple to manufacture, but it was thermally crippled and desperately lacked the volumetric efficiency required to produce serious highway horsepower. The flathead routed exhaust gases through the engine block itself, creating massive localized heat pooling that limited compression ratios and caused catastrophic pre-ignition if pushed too hard. The engineering department proposed a massive, unprecedented leap forward by developing a highly complex overhead valve V-twin engine. This was a bet-the-farm moment for Milwaukee, as developing entirely new tooling and casting procedures for an advanced power plant threatened to bankrupt the already fragile corporation. If this new high-performance engine failed on the public roads or alienated their core ridership with massive mechanical failures, it would likely destroy the motor company completely. The uncomfortable truth is that when they finally released this machine, it was severely flawed, prone to catastrophic oil leaks, and plagued by severe valve train containment issues. If detailed technical breakdowns of motorcycle history and classic American iron interest you, subscribe, because I have got more of these deep dives coming. The motorcycle born from this desperate corporate gamble was officially designated the Harley-Davidson EL61, though history would forever remember it by a much more visceral nickname. Because of the massive polished aluminum rocker box nuts protruding from the cylinder heads, the engine looked remarkably like two clenched fists sitting in the frame. Enthusiasts quickly dubbed it the Knucklehead, establishing a naming convention based on cylinder head shapes that would persist through the panhead, the AMF-era shovelhead, and beyond. But those clenched fists were not just a stylistic choice. They were a complex and deeply flawed mechanical housing for a revolutionary valve train. Moving the valves from the engine block to the cylinder head fundamentally changed the physics of how the motorcycle generated power. By utilizing a hemispherical combustion chamber, the engineers allowed the 61 cubic inch V-twin to breathe deeply through a cross-flow intake and exhaust design. This spherical chamber provided an ideal shape for the explosive flame front to propagate evenly across the piston crown, significantly increasing the thermodynamic efficiency. Furthermore, isolating the exhaust valve in the finned cylinder head rather than the engine block allowed the devastating exhaust heat to dissipate into the slipstream rather than soaking into the cylinders. But this brilliant solution to thermal management immediately introduced a severe new engineering challenge regarding valve actuation and lubrication. In a flathead, the camshaft sits right next to the valves in the lower engine case, requiring very little mechanical complexity to push the valves open. For the Knucklehead, engineers had to actuate overhead valves using a single bottom-mounted camshaft, requiring long push rods to span the distance from the engine cases to the top of the cylinder heads. These push rods operated at extreme angles, transferring immense mechanical stress up to the rocker arms that ultimately pushed the valves downward against heavy retaining springs. This complex geometry meant the top end of the engine generated intense friction and required a massive, constant supply of lubrication to survive. Previously, Harley-Davidson had relied on a total loss oiling system, where oil was dripped onto the engine internals and eventually burned off or blown out onto the road. The Knucklehead introduced a modern dry sump circulating lubrication system, utilizing a mechanical pump to feed oil under pressure to the moving parts and a scavenge pump to return it to a separate horseshoe-shaped tank. While this dry sump system was a monumental leap forward in sustaining engine life, it immediately exposed the primitive sealing technology of the 1930s. The early 1936 Knucklehead engines leaked oil with a severity that infuriated dealerships and terrified owners who watched their expensive new machines mark their territory aggressively. The pressurized oil pushed up into the overhead rocker boxes, but the early joints, gaskets, and lack of adequate crankcase breathing meant the oil had nowhere to go but out. Riders quickly found their boots, trousers, and the entire rear half of the motorcycle coated in a thick film of hot, dirty engine oil. Harley-Davidson engineers were forced to desperately retrofit external oil lines, specialized cups, and improved gaskets in subsequent production years just to keep the oil inside the engine where it belonged. Beneath those leaking rocker boxes, the bottom end of the engine established an architectural blueprint that would define the American V-twin for nearly a century. It utilized a single-pin crankshaft with fork and blade connecting rods, meaning both pistons shared the exact same point of rotation on the crank. Because the cylinders were set at a tight 45-degree angle, this single-pin design resulted in a highly irregular, galloping firing order. The rear cylinder fired, then 315 degrees of rotation. Later the front cylinder fired, followed by a massive 405-degree gap of rotational silence. This specific, uneven firing cadence produced immense low-end torque, allowing the heavy motorcycle to pull cleanly from idle without stalling. But it also generated brutal, high-frequency vibration. At highway speeds, the engine shook violently within the rigid frame, transferring harmonic fatigue directly into the rider's hands, feet, and lower spine. Bolts routinely vibrated loose, light bulbs shattered in their sockets, and the metal fenders frequently cracked around their mounting points from the relentless mechanical assault. The factory expected riders to be vigilant mechanics, requiring them to constantly walk around the motorcycle with a wrench, tightening hardware before every major ride. Fuel delivery was handled by a massive brass Linkert carburetor, a device that was incredibly reliable, once tuned, but demanded an intimate mechanical understanding from the operator. The Linkert utilized a side draft design with adjustable high and low-speed fuel jets that required constant tweaking depending on altitude, temperature, and barometric pressure. The rider had to manually manage a mechanical choke lever and physically adjust the ignition spark advance using a twist grip on the left side of the handlebars. Starting a cold knucklehead was less of a mechanical procedure and more of an esoteric religious ritual involving fuel priming, compression finding, and violently kicking a heavy pedal. Once the 61 cubic inch engine roared to life, transferring that massive torque to the rear wheel required an entirely new, reinforced drivetrain. The old 3-speed sliding gear transmissions used on the flatheads were simply too weak to handle the abrupt power delivery of the overhead valve architecture. Harley-Davidson introduced a heavy-duty 4-speed constant mesh transmission housed in a massive cast-iron case that added significant weight but provided essential durability. In a constant mesh gearbox, the gears are always physically engaged with one another, and gear selection is achieved by moving heavy steel dog clutches into engagement, eliminating the catastrophic gear grinding of earlier designs. Operating this new 4-speed transmission required a level of physical coordination that is entirely alien to modern motorcycle riders. The clutch was operated by a large rocker pedal located on the left floorboard, utilizing an over-center spring that allowed the rider to lock the clutch in the disengaged position. Shifting gears required the rider to remove their left hand from the handlebars entirely and physically manipulate a slotted steel shift lever mounted on the side of the fuel tank. This combination of a foot-operated clutch and a tank-mounted handshifter meant the rider was constantly dancing on the machine, balancing immense weight while navigating complex mechanical linkages. This overwhelming agricultural power plant dictated the necessity for an entirely redesigned and heavily reinforced chassis to keep the motorcycle from tearing itself apart. The old single down-tube frames used on the lighter side valve models flexed violently under the torque of the Knucklehead, inducing terrifying high-speed steering wobbles. Milwaukee engineers designed a massive double down-tube cradle frame, utilizing heavy steel tubing joined together by elaborately cast iron lugs that were brazed by hand at the factory. This new truss frame was incredibly strong and rigid, completely eliminating the frame flex issues, but it added tremendous unsprung weight to an already massive motorcycle. The rear of this heavy frame was entirely rigid, possessing absolutely no rear suspension linkage, swing arm, or shock absorbers of any kind. Every single pothole, expansion joint, and piece of gravel on the abysmal rural roads of the 1930s was transmitted directly through the rear axle and into the chassis. To save the rider from permanent spinal damage, the factory mounted a large, heavily padded tractor-style saddle onto a central steel plunger. This seat post slid down into the frame tube and was suspended by a heavy internal coil spring, providing a few inches of vertical travel to absorb the most punishing impacts. At the front end, the Knucklehead utilized Harley-Davidson's iconic Springer fork, a brilliant but inherently compromised piece of mechanical engineering. The Springer was a leading link design, utilizing rigid front legs that pivoted at the bottom, pushing against a set of exposed compression and rebound springs mounted near the steering head. Because there was no hydraulic damping fluid involved, the springs absorbed the initial impact of a bump quite well, but then immediately rebounded with violent, uncontrolled force. The factory attempted to mitigate this by adding a friction steering damper and a friction ride control knob, allowing the rider to literally clamp down on the springs to slow their movement. The leading link geometry of the Springer fork resulted in a fascinating and somewhat alarming handling dynamic when the rider applied the front brakes. Unlike modern telescopic forks that dive downward under heavy deceleration, the physics of the leading link caused the front end of the Knucklehead to physically rise up during braking. This changing suspension geometry altered the steering trail mid-corner, requiring the rider to constantly muscle the wide handlebars to keep the heavy motorcycle tracking on its intended line. It demanded a proactive, physical riding style, forcing the operator to anticipate corners long before they arrived and commit to heavy steering inputs with broad shoulders. Knowing what you now know about its real-world handling, heavy hand shifting, and maintenance-heavy reliability, would you still want this parked in your garage today? Share your thoughts below. When those corners arrived, scrubbing off speed was a terrifying proposition thanks to the severely inadequate mechanical single-leading shoe drum brakes. Braking force was transmitted from the levers to the brake cams via braided steel cables and solid steel rods, which flexed and stretched significantly under pressure. Stopping a 600-pound motorcycle from a cruising speed of 70 miles per hour using a tiny mechanical front drum felt more like making a gentle suggestion than executing a physical command. Riders rapidly learned to rely heavily on engine braking and the larger rear drum brake, deliberately dragging the rear wheel to bring the massive iron beast to a halt. To understand why Harley-Davidson accepted these massive compromises in handling and braking, you have to look at the vast, sprawling reality of the North American continent. British manufacturers like Norton and Triumph were building lighter, nimbler overhead valve, sporting singles and early parallel twins that handled beautifully on twisting English country lanes. However, those high-revving British machines felt strained, fragile, and utterly exhausted when forced to cross the endless, straight, and punishing stretches of the American Midwest. The Knucklehead was not designed to carve through tight canyon roads. It was designed to settle into a deep, rhythmic lope and eat thousands of highway miles without exploding. The operational reality of owning a Knucklehead in the 1940s meant accepting that you were essentially piloting a high-maintenance piece of industrial farm equipment. The total absence of modern oil seals meant a rider was perpetually wiping down the engine cases, and the solid lifters required constant manual adjustment to prevent the valve train from tearing itself to pieces. A factory tool kit was not a polite accessory. It was an absolute survival necessity, heavily utilized on the side of the road to adjust primary chains, clean fouled spark plugs, and tighten the ever-loosening chassis bolts. Yet, despite the constant weeping of fluids and the need for meticulous shade tree wrenching, the massive bottom end of the engine was virtually indestructible. This unkillable lower-end architecture is exactly what allowed the Knucklehead to transcend its origins as a Depression-era gamble and become the founding father of American chopper culture. After World War II, thousands of young combat veterans returned home with pockets full of discharge pay and a profound craving for adrenaline that civilian life simply could not satisfy. They bought up surplus knuckleheads and older flatheads for pennies on the dollar, dragging them into residential garages to strip away everything that did not make the motorcycle go faster. They unbolted the massive steel fenders, removed the heavy front brakes entirely, threw away the extensive crash bars, and chopped the frames to create lighter, infinitely faster, and highly dangerous machines. These returning veterans recognized what the factory engineers had stumbled upon. The overhead valve V-twin produced a power delivery so intoxicating that it forgave almost all of its mechanical sins. The bobbers and choppers born from these modified knuckleheads launched the outlaw motorcycle club culture, forever associating the deep, uneven rhythm of the 45-degree engine with rebellion and freedom. The visual language of the stripped-down knucklehead, with its teardrop fuel tank, rigid frame stance, and acres of exposed mechanical componentry, became the absolute template for American motorcycle styling. Even today, custom builders spend tens of thousands of dollars trying to replicate the exact mechanical aesthetic that Harley-Davidson engineers designed, purely out of functional desperation in 1936. By 1948, Harley-Davidson realized they had to address the severe thermal and oil containment flaws of the knucklehead, leading them to transition into the panhead era. The panhead was essentially the exact same lower engine architecture, but it replaced the heavy, leaking cast-iron rocker boxes with smooth, enclosed aluminum cylinder heads to dramatically improve cooling and finally stop the oil leaks. The factory also introduced hydraulic valve lifters to eliminate the constant need for manual valve lash adjustments, directly solving the two most infuriating ownership realities of the knucklehead era. But it is crucial to understand that the panhead was not a clean-sheet design. It was merely a necessary refinement of the massive engineering risks taken 12 years earlier. This foundational architectural footprint cast an incredibly long shadow over the entire global motorcycle industry, defining the motor company's trajectory for the next 8 decades. The knucklehead's genetic code, the single-pin crank, the fork and blade connecting rods, the single 4-lobe camshaft, and the 45-degree cylinder angle, was carried directly into the panhead. From there, it survived the brutal corporate buyout years to become the heart of the AMF-era shovelhead, an engine that stubbornly defended the heavyweight touring crown against the invasion of cheap, reliable Japanese inline fours. Eventually, this exact same geometric blueprint was refined and modernized into the legendary Evolution engine in the 1980s, saving the company from bankruptcy a second time. Looking back at the 1936 EL61 from a modern, critical perspective requires stripping away decades of romanticized nostalgia and acknowledging its brutal realities. It was a heavy, vibrating, oil-leaking brute of a machine with terrifying brakes, an archaic shifting mechanism, and a front suspension system that actively fought the rider during heavy deceleration. It demanded vast amounts of physical strength to operate at low speeds and required a high level of mechanical sympathy to keep it running on cross-country journeys. The factory rushed the initial design into production out of pure financial desperation, effectively using the paying public as their final quality control testing department. Yet, despite all of these glaring mechanical flaws, the Knucklehead is undeniably the most important motorcycle Harley-Davidson ever produced, because it established the permanent DNA of the American touring heavyweight. It proved that a massive V-twin could produce reliable overhead valve power, effectively ending the dominance of the thermally inefficient side valve flatheads that had choked the industry for decades. It forced competitors to either adapt to this new standard of high-torque highway cruising or fade into historical irrelevance, completely reshaping the commercial battlefield of the middle 20th century. The Knucklehead did not just save a dying corporation from the economic abyss of the Great Depression. It built an architectural dynasty that continues to roll off assembly lines today. If you found this analysis useful, a like helps more people discover these deep dives. Thanks for watching.